Hello. Hello. Thank you. Well, this is my first time this festival chairing in the large theatre, and you get comfy seats. In all the other ones, you just sit on the floor. It's unbelievable. Well, welcome to this Edinburgh International Book Festival event. Music was my first love. I'm your chair, Daniel Gray, and joining me this afternoon is Alan Johnson. Londoner Alan was once a shelf stacker, dreaming of his big break into pop music, playing in 2 local bands. For 20 years, he was a postal worker and rose through the ranks of the Communication Workers Union, becoming General Secretary in 1992. He was elected to Parliament as MP for Hull West and Hessel in 1997 and served in 5 cabinet positions under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Alan left Parliament in 2017. In My Life, a musical memoir, is his 4th book, and it follows the prize-winning volumes This Boy, Please Mr. Postman, and The Long and Winding Road. Like all sensible people, he lives in Yorkshire. Alan's going to read a little from the book, then I'll ask him a question or 2, and then it's over to you, the audience. There will, of course, be a book signing afterwards in the signing tent just next door. Do come and join us there. But for now, Alan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Just to explain the context of this book tracks 25 years from 1957, which was my earliest music memory, through to 1982, when I sent a load of my songs, my brilliant songs. I was a brilliant songwriter. If you're very good, I might give you a glimpse into my genius later. I just sat down and, just on acoustic guitar, taped about 10 songs and sent them off to Elvis Costello in 1982. And as I say in the book, I'm still waiting for a reply, which is when I decided to go off and do other things. And so this year that I'm going to read you from is 1975. I'm a postman living on a big council estate in Slough called the Britwell Estate. And the actual chapter heading is Born to Run by Bruce Springsteen. I'm a big Springsteen fan. But I don't want to talk about Springsteen. I want to talk about when the Bay City Rollers came to Slough. The right context, I think, in their home city. In the spring of 1975, the boys with the calf-length tartan-edged trousers and tartan scarves were carrying all before them. They were number 1 in the charts with the old Four Seasons hit Bye Bye Baby. They had their own television program called Shang-a-Lang and were conquering countries all around the globe. I seem to remember that their stay at the Holiday Inn in Slough was meant to be a secret, but it seemed a chambermaid couldn't resist telling her friends. Despite the absence of social media in those far-off days, this kind of news always spread faster than a virulent epidemic. My colleagues in the sorting office reported seeing legions of young girls gravitating towards and congregating outside the newly built hotel. I had a direct interest in this intelligence as I was scheduled to do the Langley collection that evening, and one of the pillar boxes I had to clear was only a few meters from the hotel. By the time I reached the Holiday Inn at about 6:15 p.m., there was a police cordon outside the hotel, and the multitude of girls being penned back into the area around my pillar box must have numbered a couple of thousand. The crowd was dense and boisterous. There was even a girl sitting on top of my pillar box. The main road had been reduced to a single lane, and I couldn't get my van anywhere near the box. Pushing through this throng with my sack and big bunch of keys would have been hard enough. The chances of opening the box, clearing the mail, and getting back to the van were more or less 0. I calculated that to attempt it would have constituted a risk to life and limb. As this was the final port of call on my collection, I turned the van round and headed straight back to the sorting office, leaving the pillar box unopened. The supervisor in charge that evening was Lenny Hayes, a big rollicking cockney who fully justified the overused accolade larger than life. Len was an avid Arsenal supporter who had a unique match day quirk. He would light a cigarette immediately the game kicked off, smoke continuously throughout the match. As the final whistle blew, he would stub out his latest fag, irrespective of how far through smoking it he was, and not touch another one until the start of the next game, when the whole business would be repeated. I thought that perhaps he was a former smoker who'd given up, but couldn't help backsliding during an absorbing match. But Len told me he had never smoked in his life, except at the football. He claimed it helped him cope with the stress. When I reported my inability to get to the Langley pillar box, Len's response was theatrical. Sounding like Sir Laurence Olivier in Henry V, he held court loudly in the middle of the sorting office floor, railing against the army of girls who were preventing the Queen's mail from getting through, which was inaccurate in any case since the mail was being prevented from coming out, not getting through, and pledging to rectify the situation personally. If there had been a horse nearby, I'm sure Len would have leapt upon it. As it was, he collared me to drive back out to the Holiday Inn with him on board, loins girded for the struggle ahead. When he saw the crowd, which had swelled even further since my last visit, Len sat back in the passenger seat, swearing softly to himself. It looked as if every girl under 16 from Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Middlesex was outside that hotel. Len didn't lack courage. Taking a deep breath, he jumped out of the van in his shirt sleeves and tie and plunged into the throng, singling out the big metal key from the bunch he held in one giant paw and clutching a dusty grey post sack in the other. I waited in the van with the engine running, watching Big Lenny's head bobbing around. Then it disappeared from view. 10 minutes later, he returned, shirt rumpled, tie askew, and mail sack still empty. As I turned the van round and headed back to the sorting office, he recounted dejectedly how, as he'd inched his way towards the pillar box through a mass of humanity denser than any he'd ever experienced at a football match, a girl shouted that she thought she'd caught sight of Woody, the Rollers guitarist, on the balcony of one of the rooms. The crowd surged, the screaming rose in pitch and volume, and Lenny, carried away from the pillar box on the tide, made the sensible decision that he'd like to see his wife and kids again. He deserted the battlefield. Mission aborted. He was unusually quiet during the drive back to the sorting office. I lit a cigarette and asked him if he wanted one. To my amazement, he accepted. Rollermania must have been the only thing Lenny Hayes ever experienced that was more stressful than watching Arsenal. Thank you.
Alan, we've had, as I mentioned, the other 3 volumes of memoir. Did you always have it in your mind that you wanted to write a separate one, focusing on music?
No, actually, when I'd finished the memoirs, which took me up to 2010, and that's as far as I wanted to go, I was keen to write fiction. To which a cynic may say, why don't you write your next party manifesto? But that would be a very cynical view of politics. But, I've always read fiction. See, I mean, my mum, who had a very hard life, anyone who read my childhood memoir will know that would wonder why she instinctively, in the early 50s, dragged me and my sister along to the library almost as soon as were big enough to turn a page. She had no books in her life, but had this instinctive view that books were good for children, that the earlier you put words in their head, the better it would be for them. Now, everyone knows that now. It's it's educational thesis written on this stuff. But that wasn't common in the early 50s. So this developed a love of reading, and from a very young age, I usually read fiction, and I wanted to write fiction. But my agent said, look, you've mentioned a lot about music, but you haven't gone into any detail about this big passion of yours. In fact, I played in a couple of bands, made a record when I was 16. Don't listen to it, it's on YouTube, but you'd have a better cultural experience not bothering. All of that was really interesting to me. And the more my agent spoke about it, the more it occurred to me that we baby boomers, I see there's a few others out there, we had this incredible vantage point, and we were incredibly lucky in many ways. But in music, we were there at the birth of what you would call rock and roll. If that was Bill Haley and the Comets or Elvis Presley. We lived through all that. We lived through the coming of the Beatles, and that changed my life and changed the world. We were there living it in real time. And we also saw the way that listening to music developed. It is a slice of social history. Because when we were kids, we couldn't listen to the music we loved. The BBC didn't cater for it. They had this agreement with the Musicians' Union where they could only play, I think, 16 hours a week recorded music. So if you wanted to listen to records, you had to try and get Radio Luxembourg. Now, I'll test out the audience here, see how many baby boomers are here. If I got a crystal radio set, my mum bought me when I was about 8, and you had a bit of wire you put over something, and then you spent ages trying to get through to 208 it was on a long wave. And if you could get through the static about 7 o'clock at night, instead of hearing the Everly Brothers or Bobby V, you got this bloke who had a foolproof method for winning the pools called Horace Batchelor. I was only 8, and I thought, if he's got a foolproof method for winning the pools, how come he's not winning the pools every week? And at the end, he would say, if you wanted to write to him for his infradraw method, you had to write to Horace Batchelor, Unit 2, Keynsham, spelled Keynsham, Keynsham, Bristol. He always rolled his R's. There you go. There's a shared experience that we all live through. And then it's 7:30, you still haven't heard Bobby V or the Everly Brothers. There's some American evangelist. I know this is the New York Times, so I just mentioned an American evangelist called Garner Ted Armstrong. He used to frighten the life out of me. This is Garner Ted Armstrong with the world tomorrow. Radio would shake, and eventually you would get some pop music. So that was, I think, an interesting slice of social history, which made it, I think, I got more enthusiastic about it the more I thought about it.
Do you think you appreciated music more in a slightly older generation because you had to work harder for it? Now I can go into my phone and listen to anything I want after this. And then going through the different methods you talk about in the book, through vinyl, through the cassettes you had, through the CD, and to what we have now.
Well, I suppose you did, but everything then, kind of no matter where you were, you always seemed to have less money around in those days anyway. So I think you treasured a lot of things more, but we treasured those vinyl 45 RPM records. I bet almost all of this audience of a certain age will remember the first record they ever bought. And you're right, because it was so rare, I suppose it was more highly valued.
And more of a ceremony to buying a record, then taking it out and looking at the lyrics and the artwork.
Yeah. And going in the record shop and asking them to play it while you stood in one of those little booths. And you had no intention of buying it. It was just another way of hearing that record. All of that was amazing. But everything we heard came from America. It was all transatlantic. And we launched this book in Studio 2 Abbey Road, which is where the Beatles recorded most of their great hits. We launched it last September in hardback. And while I was there, I learned a couple of things about Studio 2 Abbey Road and about the history of British pop music. Studio 2 was where Mandy Miller recorded Nellie the Elephant in 1956.
Seminal.
And that, us from a certain generation, we listened to Nellie the Elephant on a Saturday morning, along with Sparky the Magic Piano and Burl Ives, the old lady who swallowed a fly, and Danny Kaye's The Ugly Duckling. But that was British pop music circa 1956. Two interesting facts I learnt about Nellie the Elephant. Number one, it was produced by George Martin, who went on to become almost the fifth Beatle. And number two, of course, Mandy Miller foresaw the coming of the 47th President of the United States, because you remember Nellie packed her trunk, said goodbye to the circus, off she went with a trumpety trump, 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 trump. I so wanted the band of the Coldstream Guards to play that when he came over on that state visit. As he went down the Mall, song that was perhaps he'll play it when he eventually goes to Greenland after he's purchased it for a knockdown price.
The book takes a year-by-year approach in which you focus on a band or a song or an artist in particular. were there any years in which you struggled?
No. I might have struggled a bit after 82 because the more it came close to the present day, the less that rarity that you were talking about. I mean, suddenly I could afford to buy more stuff, but we'd already gone from vinyl to audio cassette, compact audio cassettes. Remember them? Horrible little things. And then we were coming out into CDs. And now we're back into vinyl and all kinds. I bought a new car the other week. Wouldn't take CDs. You can't now. We'd all have to move off of CDs now to all the downloading and Spotify's and Bluetooth and all that.
So there is a reason you stop in 1982. It isn't because you dislike music that's followed since. What's the key reason you stop in 1982?
No, I've loved loads of music. I mean, if anyone asks me what's my favourite era in music, I say now, because you've got all that back catalogue, and you've got Christine and the Queens, you've got John Grant, you've got all these great artists now. But no, I stopped there because that's when I sent those songs off. I really was serious about this. In fact, you've been good enough so far. I'll give you a glimpse into my songwriting genius. So when I was 18...
Bring the guitar on.
When I was 18, I wrote a song about a lad with acne called Bad Skin. I've got acne, I've got eczema, I've got every skin disease. Gives me pimples I can pick, gives me blackheads I can squeeze. Now... I'm sure you'll agree that's Dylan-esque in itself, but the genius was the middle eight. How can any girl want to be with ya when every kiss she gets just tastes of Nivea? Genius or what? And that was one of the 10 songs I sent off to Elvis, and Elvis Costello. I've listened to all his albums just to make sure he didn't nick it, because it's copyrighted. So that was when I decided that I'd go off and do some other things.
And going backwards then, it's very clear that certain songs and bands attach themselves to memories with you, so you're able to picture the girlfriend or indeed negative events. So we talk early on about Tom Dooley and Skiffle, and it's associated that era with your father going.
Yeah, well, my mother mainly. Well, that's because music is so evocative, isn't it? If you're going to write a memoir, you mention a piece of music and a memory comes back from that time. It's the most powerful evocation you can get. And so 1957, my earliest music memory was a Sunday lunchtime, although we didn't call it lunchtime, it was dinner time. If you had anything to eat in the evening, it would be for your tea. Mm-hmm. And the only time I ever heard the words lunch or supper mentioned was on the Archers or Mrs. Dale's diary. So it was dinner time in North Kensington, where I was born and bred. And when my childhood memoir was published in 2013, I was here from 2014 onwards, actually. I had to go to some lengths to explain to the audience that North Kensington wasn't Notting Hill. This whole area, swathe of West London, has become known by this generic term, Notting Hill. We lived in North Kensington. We didn't see Hugh Grant or Julia Roberts round our way very much. Sadly now, people know where North Kensington is because of Grenfell Tower. And they know about the poverty in North Kensington. And we've got epidemiologists now who can measure these health inequalities. So a boy born in North Kensington, as I was, will on average die 16 years earlier than a boy born in South Kensington. That's one London borough, the Royal Borough of Kensington. So North Kensington was always very poor. And there are lots of poor areas, Liverpool, Manchester, Edinburgh, Glasgow, always poor, terrible housing conditions, which virtually went by the 60s. Poverty didn't go by the 60s, but those dreadful, unsanitary housing conditions. So in North Kensington, where we lived, on a Sunday lunchtime, 12 noon, there was a pub on every corner, a piano in the corner of every pub, and my father's posterior had been parked on virtually every one of them because he was a pub pianist. Eventually ran off when I was 8 with a barmaid at one of the pubs he was at, and we didn't. That was him out of our lives. But this is 1957, the year before he went. He was off to the pub, and it looked like it was a call to prayer. Every man in North Kensington seemed to be going off to the pub on a Sunday lunchtime, and they were all done up in suit, white shirt, and tie. No matter how poor they were, it was the D-mob suit. but you wouldn't be seen dead in the pub on a Sunday lunchtime without suit and tie. As they went off, on the radio came two-way family favourites on the Light programme. So you only had 3 radio programmes. I'm telling you this because you're such a youngster, Dan.
I've read it though.
You know, so we had a radio rentals radio. My mum must have paid for it sort of 100 times over because we rented it. And they would come and kind of plumb it in up high, big thing, and all the wires would come down onto a Bakelite oval that was fixed to a wooden door frame with a switch with 1, 2, 3. 1 was the Light programme, 2 was the home service, 3 was the third programme. So if you like classical music, that was fine. If you were waiting for pop music, you'd wait for a long time on a Light programme, but two-way family favourites on a Sunday lunchtime, I bet 98% of the population would have been tuned in to that programme. And it was requests for soldiers abroad, for their families back home, and vice versa. And on this Sunday, I can see it now. You talk about a memory evoking a scene. We lived in 2 rooms in this slum in North Kensington, and it had a gas cooker on the landing, and my mother was out there murdering the veg. She was a terrible cook. Great in many ways, but a terrible cook. And on the radio, on two-way family favourites, the record that received the most requests was called the Bumper Bundle. And there was always a little drum roll for the Bumper Bundle. It was the highlight of the show. And on this week, it was True Love by Bing Crosby and Grace Kelly. See my mother now, coming off the landing, coming in, shushing me and my sister, who was a couple of years older than me, into silence, sinking into this battered old chair with the tablecloth across her, with the tea cloth across her knees. Always wore a turban and a house coat, listening to Bing and Grace, who transported her. She had a terrible life. She had this heart condition called mitral stenosis that she would convince. Her mother had had 11 children by the age of 38, died when she was 42 in Liverpool. Her mother, my mother's grandmother, had died when she was 42. My mother was always convinced she would die at age 42, and she did. But here in 1957, she's in her mid-30s, loved Grace Kelly. And all her hardship, my father used to come home when he was drunk, beat her up, all of that. She had a terrible hard time. But for this, 3 minutes, while Bing and Grace were singing that lovely Cole Porter song, she was transported. You could see her sitting in the armchair being transported away from the hard life she was living. And that was a powerful message about music. It was a lovely song, and it's it forms my earliest music memory.
How do you characterise...
Thank you. Fans of two-way family favourites, yeah.
How do you characterise then for you what music is for? What's it about? An escape? It's not just a hobby.
Well, me and my sister have always said, my sister's lived in Australia since the early 80s, so she's obviously in a musical desert out there, but she's always said, I bet they're beating us at cricket at the moment as well. We've always said that we don't go with this thing about music being an escape. We didn't know we were poor. We didn't even know we were living in slums. Everybody around us lived the same way. In fact, as I say in the book, my mum, to sort of keep house and home together, especially after my old man went, at least she used to be able to nick some money off of him. When he was lying comatose the next morning after a night on the booze, she would nick some of his small change and have some money. When he went, she didn't know where he went. In those days, there was no child support agency. You had to try and track them down to get maintenance. So it was much more difficult after he'd gone. So what were we talking about?
Just what is it for you?
Music is. So she used to clean and scrub for all these posh families, many of whom were very kind to her, by the way, in South Kensington. And she did loads of charring jobs, which she shouldn't have been doing because of her heart condition. She shouldn't have been living in those damp conditions, but she was. And so she would do all these cleaning jobs, and in the summer holidays, if it was nice weather, we'd go and play over Kensington Gardens, me and my sister, or we'd go down to museums in Exhibition Road. But if it was raining, sometimes she'd have to take us with her. So we went into these very posh houses with very posh people there, And there was one place where we'd heard that the children who were about our age at that house had been sent to boarding school when they were 6 or 7. To us, that was deprivation. They were the ones who were poor, not us. We felt sorry for them. So if those kids who, had no control over their lives, as much control as we did, liked pop music, it wouldn't have been an escape for them, and it wasn't an escape for us. It was part of our lives, just like living there was part of our lives, just like everything around us was slum conditions, but we didn't know there were slums. So no, it wasn't an escape. It was a passion. It was an enhancement to our lives. It was something that we were excited about to an incredible degree. We were just a bit fed up that everything we listened to was transatlantic, except my sister loved Cliff Richard, and I'm not going to have a war with any Cliff Richard fans here, least of all because my mother-in-law's over there, and she's the biggest Cliff Richard fan apart from my sister. But Cliff was a kind of Elvis Presley tribute act, yeah? I mean, you see Cliff in the early days, just like Billy, Fury, Marty Wilde, they all tried to be Elvis. Which is why which is why British pop music kind of was just, never troubled the American Billboard 100. I mean, what was Pinky and Perky all about? Do you remember that? 3 top 10 hits. I'll explain to you, Dan, 2 porcine puppets who talk about you could see the strings. Even the puppetry wasn't very good. But they'd sing with these speeded up little piggy voices, and they'd make the UK top 10. I mean, me and my sister could be accused of many things, but we could never be accused of buying a Pinky and Perky record. Those who did, I understand, would put it on the dance set. You had 3 speeds, 33 and a third, 45, and 78 for the old shellac predecessors to vinyl. You'd put Pinky and Perky on at 33 and a third to slow it right down and listen to the non-piggy voices. That passed for entertainment in the late 50s, in those bleak pre-Beatles days for us. And so that's why, when the Beatles came along, it was so exciting. Suddenly, I remember watching Ready, Steady, Go. Remember, The Weekend Starts Here on a Friday night. In 1964, Keith Forsyth, Cathy McGowan presenting it. It was live. They stopped the program to announce that the Beatles were #1 in America. And within a couple of weeks, they were #1, #2, #3, #4, #5, #6 on the Billboard 100. I mean, there was a sense of patriotism to this, apart from anything else. We'd invaded America, we'd even invaded the American charts. Bliss to be alive,
As we've heard, it wasn't just about listening, it was about playing as well. Tell us about the liberation of the family piano and how you came to have a Spanish guitar, which I think is a transformative thing in your life. Really.
Yeah, well, my dad was a very talented pianist. Could listen to a piece of music and reproduce it. That's how my mum met him. In the war, she left Liverpool to come and work in the NAFI down in London. And he was a lance corporal, but he played in army concerts with white gloves. Ginger Johnson, he was kind of a bit of a celebrity. And he whisked my mother off her feet, took her back to where he came from, North Kensington. And although he was such a talented pianist, and although there was always a piano, if there was nothing else in our houses, various places we lived in, rooms we lived in, there was a piano in the corner. He kept the keyboard locked. As I find anyone with kids would want their kids to kind of have access to your talent, not my father. As soon as he went, in 1958, ran off with that barmaid, my sister, who's much more, as anyone's read my books, very much the hero of my childhood, she wrenched it open with a screwdriver and released the keys into the community. But by then, I'd seen Lonnie Donegan at the Chiswick Empire. And my mother, I don't know how my mother did this, but she knew my sister loved Cliff Richard. So she managed to get tickets free tickets that the London Evening Standard were running, London newspaper, for matinee performances at the London Palladium, where they had 400 tickets for young girls who wanted to go and see Cliff. My mum got one for my sister. I say in the book, we walked her to London Palladium and then left her for 2 hours screaming at Cliff till she came out 2 hours later, exhausted. But as my sister had seen Cliff, I had to see Lonnie. And my mother, just me and my mother, Chiswick Empire, December 1958. Lonnie Donegan I think was second on the bill. At the top of the bill was a singer called Joan Regan, you might remember, as a big British pop star. But seeing Lonnie there playing, the Battle of New Orleans and all these kind of folk songs he was singing, and standing with that guitar, I wanted to play the guitar. My mum had a little win on the pools.
Because of the radio show.
Because of a radio show, yeah. No, not because of Horace Batchelor, no. Just pure luck, I think. And she bought Linda a Dan set record player, which meant I shared it because we shared a room. She couldn't play it without me. And she bought me a guitar, just a cheap sort of Spanish full-size guitar. I'd had a little plastic Tommy Steele guitar before then, but this is a proper guitar. And it came with a book, Play in a Day by Bert Weedon. It should have been prosecuted under the Trades Description Act. I actually thought I could sit down at 9 o'clock in the morning with Bert's book and get up at 5 o'clock in the evening and I'd be able to play, I'd be proficient guitarist. It took me about 4 years, so playing 4 years should have been the title. But anyway, I learnt to play all by myself with courtesy of Bert Weedon and that guitar that my mother got me. And my mother actually had a say in every guitar that came along, as I say in the book, because after she died, me and my sister, thanks to my Linda's indefatigability, and a great social worker called Mr. Pepper, not Sergeant Pepper. So I was 13, my sister was 15, just turning 16, and we had no parents. And I said to my sister, what do we do? My sister said, say nothing, otherwise the authorities will come and split us up. Don't say anything to anyone at school, she ordered me. I mean, it was incredible that we were on no one's radar, but they were pulling down our latest slum we lived in Walmer Road, just about where Grenfell Tower is now. And so we got an offer. My mum got an offer at the council house she'd always dreamt of 2 weeks after she died. Letter came through the door, Mrs. L.M. Johnson, council house in Welwyn Garden City. My sister picked it up, went straight round to the council, said, my mother's dead, but me and my brother will have this. And the council official said, don't be so stupid, you're just bits of kids. The age of majority then was 21. He said, I'll send round a social worker. And into our life came Mr. Pepper. But it didn't start well. Mr. Pepper's our hero to me and my sister, but it didn't start well. He came into the room we lived in Walmer Road. I was there with my sister, and he said, okay, I've arranged for Alan to go to foster parents near his school in Chelsea. Linda, who'd left school at 15 to train to be a nursery nurse, she just left school. You can go to Dr. Bernardo's at Barking, their big headquarters. You can continue to train to be a nursery nurse, and you can live in there as well. And he sat back, I think, waiting for a round of applause. Instead of that, my sister tore into him. I can see her now, hand on hip, wagging her finger under poor Mr. Pepper's nose. You're not going to split us up. Mr. Pepper said, but you can't stay on your own. She said, we've been on our own for years, as we had, because my mum was in and out of hospital all the time. So my sister had been virtually bringing me up. And in the end, Mr. Pepper went away with this giant, Linda-sized flea in his ear. And social workers tell me this would be impossible to do today. But he came back and said to Linda, okay, I've got you a flat. Certain conditions, including he comes around every 5 minutes. There's this council flat. Linda went to look at it by herself. The council must have thought 2 bits of kids will give them the worst place on the books. And Linda went to look at it. We'd lived in some bad places. This one, they'd taken all the interior doors off to burn as firewood, the previous occupants. So Linda marched to the telephone box, put her 4p in. When Mr. Pepper answered, she pressed button A, as you did in those days, and said, oh, hello, Linda, how are you? About this flat, she said, we're not accepting it. Mr. Pepper said, you can't argue with me, Linda. Do you know what I've been through to get you this? And she said, well, you go and look at it, and if you think you can live there with your family, come and look me in the eye and tell me, and I'll think about it again. And we never heard about that place again. We got this lovely 2-bedroom masonette, number 11 pit house on the Wilberforce estate in Battersea. Meant we had to go south of the Thames. That was traumatic for us, but we got over that eventually. Indoor bathroom, toilet. First time we'd ever had anything like that. And Mr. Pepper came round every 5 minutes, and then he didn't come round. He'd come round once a month, but we were fine. We lived there for 2 years until my sister got married to a bloke from Watford, and wanted me to move with her to a semi-detached in Watford. I said, I'm not moving to the north. So I went back across the Thames, back to North Kensington, and lived in Diggs. But anyway, because we were moving south of the Thames, I couldn't help this milkman called Johnny Carter, who I used to help on his milk round, anymore. And Johnny was a reformed teddy boy. He had an incredible hairstyle. They were a big family, the Carters, 6 boys. Old man Carter was a totter, a rag and bone man. He always swore that horse, Hercules, in Steptoe and Son, that he'd sold it to the BBC. And maybe he did. Johnny, who'd been a tearaway, had now settled down. I used to help him at weekends with his milk round and for 2 nights a week on a paraffin round. I'll explain what paraffin was later to you. And Johnny had this incredible, elaborate hairstyle. A Tony Curtis with a DA at the back, The D stood for ducks. You imagine what the A stood for. And as we went along in the milk float, which then as now had no doors, so every time there was a gust of wind, I see Johnny now looking out into the big wing mirrors to put his Tony Curtis back in place. Anyway, I couldn't help him with the milk round anymore because I was going south of the Thames. I was getting serious into music now. I was only 13, but I had just about to start a schoolboy band. He, at the end of the last milk round I did with him on the Sunday, he didn't say anything like, oh, sorry to hear about your mum or anything like that. Working class men in North Kensington didn't do anything sissy like that. But he said, when we've finished, come back to my place. I've got something for you. And he took me back to St Anne's Road where he lived. Took me down to the basement, which was unoccupied, had 2 big doors with a padlock on it. Took the padlock off, opened the doors, and there was this vast array of brand new musical instruments, trumpets, drum kits, trombones, electric guitars. Now, maybe in his spare time, Johnny was a distributor for a musical instrument company in between the milk round and the paraffin round. Or maybe they were nicked. I wasn't asking any questions. He said, take your pick. I know you like guitar player, take your pick of electric guitar. I picked up this beautiful sunburst-coloured Vox Solid electric guitar. The man who was to become my brother-in-law, my sister's boyfriend, Mike, made me an amplifier, and I was away. And in a sense, that was because of just like the Spanish guitar, me and my mother picked from a mail order catalogue when she had that little one on her balls. In a sense, she was responsible for me getting this guitar. And of course, there's another guitar you might want to talk about later, which she was responsible for as well.
Well, fast forward to that, in fact, because that is a beautiful story at the end of the book.
Yeah, so the Vox Solid I got going with the group called the Vampires. So I took the guitar, it came in a gingham case. I took it home, borrowed my sister's lipstick and wrote the Vampires across it with a little bit of trickle of blood coming off the S on the Vampires. And then I had to form the band. So I formed this schoolboy band. It was absolute rubbish. In fact, I was at a book festival, something like this, in, I think it was in Marlborough, and I was talking about Jimmy Robb, the drummer in the Vampires, being so bad. It reminded me of John Lennon's comments about Pete Best. John Lennon wasn't kind to drummers. When he was asked if Ringo was the best drummer in the world, his answer was he's not even the best drummer in the Beatles. But he was far more scathing about Pete Best, who got the elbow for Ringo. John Lennon's joke was, what's the difference between Pete Best and a chiropodist? And the answer is, a chiropodist bucks up your feet. Yeah, if you haven't got it now, you'll get it later. Anyway, I was saying all this at an event like this. I said Jimmy Robb was absolutely useless. And there was a little voice from the audience that said, I'm here, Alan. Jimmy Robb. So any members of the Vampires, would you like to put your hands up? But then I got onto the area and a really serious band. And we were doing lots of gigs around London and the home counties, as we used to call them, Buckinghamshire, Berkshire. Made a record when I was 16 in 1967 in Denmark Street, the heart, Tin Pan Alley, the Regent Sound Studios in Denmark Street. Oh, very exciting time. But the Vox got nicked because someone broke into our flat. Any of these politicians who trade on nostalgia, and these were days of peaceful innocence, and kind of crime began in 1987 or something. I mean, they weren't living where I was living. Bloody hell. I mean, talk about crime. Anyway, that got nicked from number 11 Pitt House where me and my sister lived. I said to my sister, I've got to have a guitar. The band's really taken off now. And I'd seen a beautiful cherry red Hofner very thin guitar. Bigsby tremolo, beautiful Venetian swirls, mother of pearl inlay. Oh, it was gorgeous. 35 quid in a guitar shop in Wardour Street in Soho. Said to my sister, I've got to get a guitar. Unbeknown to me, my mother, God knows how she'd done it, had scraped away 40 quid in a post office savings account for me and my sister. And Linda was going to give it to me when I turned 18. And now I was 16. And Linda said, look, if you want it now, you can have it now to buy that guitar. So I got the Hofner very thin and £5 to spend spare, courtesy of my mother. Once again, coming to my rescue with a guitar. Now, the story I know you, so I was actually on a radio program and I was talking about this Hofner very thin and the fact that when I was with a band called the In-Betweens, which was a really good, had a manager, multiracial, very unusual for 1967, the band that followed the area. We had all our gear nicked again, and I got my precious Hofner very thin nicked. The bass guitarist, Sham, was a West Indian guy, wanted me to start a band with him, something like the Equals, which were a big multiracial band at the time. I said, Sham, I've got to earn some money. I was going to get married when I was 18. I want to earn some money. He said, why don't you, he was a postman. He said, postman higher grade. He said, why don't you join the post office? You can earn lots of money. Anyway, I was telling this story on the radio, how my precious Hofner very thin had been nicked. And I was still an MP, and I got an email from Edinburgh, funny enough, saying, heard you on the radio, I've got a Hofner very thin. They stopped making them in '63, for sale. Would you like to buy it? So we arranged for this guy to come down to the Holiday Inn on the marina in Hull. This is 3 years back. With this Hofner very thin. So he walked into the Holiday Inn, very quiet day, nobody else in the lounge area there, opened this black guitar case, and as soon as I saw this Hofner very thin, I thought, that's my bloody guitar. Guitarists know this. There were certain distinctive features. They never made any after '63. They made a few replicas, but they never made an original Hofner very thin after '63. And it had the Bigsby tremolo, it had a black scratchboard, it had a little kind of cigarette burn, which I remember from, and I couldn't accuse this guy of nicking it. He had the reasonable alibi of not having been born at the time when my guitar got nicked. But I just knew this was my guitar. Cost me 800 quid. The guitar that I got for 35 quid. Actually, that's not a bad price for an original Hofner very thin, as you'll know as a fellow guitarist. So that was it, reunited with my Hofner very thin. There's a little serial number you can see through the Venetian swirls because it's a semi-acoustic. But I never kept the original serial number, so I'll never know, but it feels like it as I embrace it. And I love that guitar. So there you are.
As well as being a beautiful story, you've just reminded me that I owe my mum 50 quid for my first bass guitar.
Is that right?
I've been sat here feeling really guilty. I hope she's not watching.
Well, I should tell your mum.
Before
your mum, who Dan was telling me, hitchhiked up to Liverpool to go and knock on Ringo Starr's door to speak to his mum and dad.
We've got
the kind of thing the Beatles did to people.
Yeah, we've got a photo of Ringo's mum with the brilliant nose, the Starkey nose, and whatever her name was, and mum stole a bit of mud from Ringo's childhood house, which she has as well.
Can I buy that off her? Or is she?
Mum won't give it. You're talking about records. I know they're precious because she won't give me any of them. So. Before I come to audience questions, I've got a quick fire round here. Me and you, jukebox. We're down in Hull in the lovely old area by the water. We've got £1 for 3 songs. What are you putting on?
I'd take a more recent song. I want to go to Mars by John Grant. I would take Drive-In Saturday by Bowie because I love that track. It epitomises Bowie to me. I would take And Your Bird Can Sing by the Beatles.
Beautiful.
From the Revolver album, the best album.
Well, that's one of my questions. You're on a desert island. Which Beatles album are you taking? It's Revolver, isn't
I was on Desert Island Discs 12 years ago, and I chose And Your Bird Can Sing as the record I would save.
Yeah.
But, you know, I don't know, your music tastes change, but that's still for the Beatles. That was still
the loveliest
right
guitar, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Johnson supergroup, you're on guitar. Who else is in the supergroup? Of the whole...
I'd give Paul McCartney an audition, first of all, for bass guitar. I'd have, if it could resuscitate Keith Moon, I'd have him on the drums. I'd have Jeff Beck on lead guitar, and I'd play rhythm. Is that all right?
Which band do you most wish you'd been in?
Well, in a funny way, I mean, the Beatles are just too sacrosanct. I'd never, you know, so in a funny way, it's the Small Faces, because I loved watching the Small Faces. They always seem to be having such a laugh, you know. I wasn't quite small enough to be in it. You had to be under 5'6" to be in the Small Faces, but yeah, I'd have been with them.
This brings me to the question: do you think your move into politics was a replacement for your inability, unfortunate lack of justice in becoming a pop star, in the same way I've become a football writer because I could never become a footballer?
I think that's a very good question. I don't think it's the move into politics. It was the move into trade unionism. I was very excited by trade unionism, and I'm trying to my second memoir, Please Mr. Postman, was trying to recapture the untold story of social mobility in this country is the trade unions. They gave me another education. Suddenly I was in front of 2,000 delegates at the Winter Gardens in Bournemouth, where, you know, telephonists and postal clerks were making speeches about issues that affected me because it was my job in the trade union. And I caught the bug when I went to my first conference. I was about 24. And in a way, that was a performance. In a way, that was, you know, there was searchlights on the rostrum as you spoke to this vast Winter Gardens gathering. Closest thing to, you know, being on stage, which I loved when I was in those two groups. So, you know, released my natural propensity to be a show-off, I suppose. And I suppose from there it just went into politics.
And literary festivals are the new rock and roll, aren't they?
Oh, these are wonderful. I mean, you know, it's not just Edinburgh's brilliant, and I've been here, you know, 5 years. But, you know, there's little towns that have, I mean, Wigtown, for a start, we're coming to in a few, which is Book City. Edinburgh might argue with that in Scotland, but almost every medium-sized town has got a book festival now, and they're brilliant, whether it's 100 people on a wet Wednesday evening or, you know, big audience like this, or Cheltenham or Hay, or big and small. They're wonderful because the public meeting has gone out of politics almost completely. It's all social media, or it's television, or it's media, you know, radio and all of that, or social media. Whereas for books, you can come to literary festivals and speak to people who really like books and like your books sometimes, and it's just a delight. So I do as many as my wife says I only write books to go to book festivals, and I'm on the novel now, so the novel will be published next September, and it gets me another round of book festivals.
Exactly. Well, let's seamlessly go to the audience now, and hope you don't throw televisions out of hotel room windows or anything.
Oh, I'm dying to do that, yeah.
We don't have too much time, so I'll start on this side and work that way. I'll start on the left and work that way, perhaps like a political journey. If I can see your hand. Oh, not yours, just some people's.
Okay.
Right. We're not doing politics.
Well, you can if you want.
Yes, thank you very much.
Can you still play, and if so, will you do that for us now?
Can I, sorry?
Still play, but you mean...
Oh, yes.
Sadly, we left the guitar in the green room.
Yeah. I can, but you'd have to pay much more for me to play a public performance. I've already given you the lyric to one of my greatest songs. You know, what more do you want
and
out of
the
this?
free wine isn't even out in the green room yet, so there's no chance of that. Maybe if you hang around in the queue long enough, you'll get serenaded. Let's take a question. Is anyone over here? Anyone here? It's feeling like David Dimbleby.
If I may call you Alan.
Don't know where that is, but
as
ask a question.
As Holland Park lad, thank you for some wonderful memories.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Holland Park, yeah, that's... Well, did you go to Holland Park School? No, right, okay. All right, that's a West London thing.
Right, so could you just... Oh, there's the one there. Thank you. With your hand up.
Good afternoon, Alan.
Hi.
A voice from me past.
Hey, Laurie, how are you?
I'm all right, thanks.
Was the MP for Scarborough the last time Labour held Scarborough, which was 2005, Laurie?
Yeah, that's right.
Great man, by the way.
I was very taken by your anecdote about the Bay City Road.
Sound like Donald Trump, don't I? Great man, by the way. Sorry about that.
No, it's all right, all right. I was very taken, this is a literary festival, remember? I'm very taken by your anecdote about the Bay City Rollers. Now, we all know in this audience that a famous Arsenal supporter also happens to be the leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition, or whatever at the moment. Do you think if he had been your sidekick, do you think he would have been able to have delivered the mail and actually gone and dealt with all those young girls in the manner that your friend failed to achieve?
Laurie, what a skillful way of trying to get me to comment on Jeremy Corbyn. Yeah. He was like this at PMQs. He used to try and delve in. My answer to your question is no. And nice to see you, yeah.
And do we have any... Yes, just there where you are. Thank you.
As a boy from Hull myself,
Hey.
I wondered how you coped with moving north of Watford.
I cope very well. I mean, Hull, if you read The Long and Winding Road, third volume of my memoirs, you'll see that I was kind of parachuted into Hull halfway through the 97 general election when my predecessor resigned to spend more time with his peerage. So, I mean, we were in the election. Laurie remembers this. They were long, it was a long 6 weeks. And 3 weeks in, there was no time for any selection process. The NEC of the Labour Party, of which I was on, decided who the candidate should be. And I was persuaded by Tony Blair to stop being the General Secretary of the CW and to go into Hull. Now, just briefly, one of my mother's 10 siblings, my Auntie Dolly, followed her down to London. My mum left Liverpool to go and join the NAFI in London. Her younger sister, Dolly, followed in her footsteps 2 years later. And my mum at the time had a boyfriend before my dad came along called Les Foster from Hull. And my Auntie Dolly came down and nicked him off of her. And they fell out for 10 years. They never spoke. And I tell the story in this boy about me and my sister going up on a cold train from King's Cross to Hull in '56 as part of the peace process. My mum was meeting Dolly, who by then, she'd married Les, moved to Hull, they'd had 9 kids, lived on the Greatfield estate, had 9 kids. I figured I had an inbuilt majority in Hull, but 9 cousins. So I'd been to Hull once before, but when I got there, I found, you'll know all about this, Hull was the biggest distant water fishing port in the world until the Cod Wars, nothing to do with Europe, the agreement that the British government reached with Iceland to put a fishing limit around the coast of Iceland, 200 miles from 10 miles, that was the end of Hull's fishing grounds. And 7,000 people got thrown out of work. They were promised compensation, they were promised redundancy, they were promised retraining. They got nothing, because these men who worked 18 hours on and 6 hours off, in an industry that had a mortality rate 17 times higher than coal mining, the most dangerous job in the world. 900 ships lost out of Hull in 150 years of distant water trawling. These men had just been thrown on a scrap heap. All these promises, none of them were kept. And 20 years later, they were still fighting for compensation. £1,000 a year for every year at sea, capped at 20 years. That's what they wanted. Full payment to widows and dependents. The Blair government gave every penny of that. And I joined the campaign. It was right up my street. West Hull was the fishing area. So I settled in very quickly. And anyone who went there for City of Culture will know Hull is a tremendous place. I don't have to say that anymore. I'm not the MP anymore. It was kind of compulsory. But it's a wonderful place. That whole area is just wonderful, which is why I still live there.
And a great musical city as well, the House Martins and all
House
the rest.
Martins, all of that,
Probably
yeah.
time for one more question, I think. Do you have any women asking questions? No. Yes, I'd like to have a woman ask a question, just to be honest, if that's all right. It's not sexist. I'm trying
Bit
to
of gender
spread.
balance, quite right.
Yes, gender balance,
Is that?
the opposite of sexism.
Thank you. Can you tell us about your novel?
Yes, as far as, one thing I've learnt and been told, it's difficult writing a novel anyway. Somerset Maugham said there's 3 rules to writing a novel. The trouble is nobody knows what they are. I've lots of people who are really good writers, and I'm not saying I'm in that category, but they've failed at that hurdle of developing plot and character. So it's notoriously difficult. The other thing about it I've been warned about is they are absolutely remorseless in nicking other people's plots. So I'm not going to say too much about it other than it's a thriller. It's called Mascara. There are some Russians involved in it, but it's not centered around the House of Commons or anything like that. And it will be, hopefully, on sale next September, about a year's time.
So we may see you here again, perhaps.
Yes, with the fiction.
My thanks to all of you for coming along and joining in what's been a fantastic hour. We could certainly have gone on for longer. Please do come and get a book signed and meet Alan. But most of all, my thanks, with a round of applause, for Alan Johnson.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. That's great. Thank you.